the difference between demand avoidance in neurodivergence and pathological demand avoidance or pervasive drive for autonomy. So this is one of the areas that I've seen lots of parents getting confused. And for the first time, actually, in my program, for the first time in 2 years, I'm seeing parents that are confused about whether or not the demand avoidance or avoidance of things that they're seeing in their children and teens actually indicates PDA. So today, I want to help you all get through some of that confusion to understand 2 things. First, how all the different ways that we can think about demand avoidance and what the root cause of that demand avoidance might be. And then secondly, I want to support you to understand the other things that have nothing to do with demand avoidance, but are indicators that a child might be PDA. Okay? And I'm going to start with a story, and I'll tell you a little bit about my confusion as a parent early on and why I think this is so important. So my son Cooper is now 10 and well out of burnout and doing great. He's PDA, autistic, ADHD, and anxious. But when I first started learning about neurodivergence and trying to understand why he was having so much trouble moving through life and was having these huge meltdowns and avoidance of almost everything, I started working with the assumption that he had sensory processing disorder. Okay, so what does that mean? The root cause that I was understanding was causing him to avoid things like getting dressed, eating food, engaging in therapy was sensory based, okay? And let me give you 3 examples. So one thing he would do would be he would fight me getting his clothes on. He would fight me when I was trying to put him into a car seat. He would fight me when I was tying his shoes. And so I was looking through a sensory root cause, which at the time made sense, which was, oh my gosh, this seatbelt is bothering his body. It's rough against his skin. He's super sensitive to tactile things, and that's why he's physically attacking me in response to trying to safely put him in the car seat. Oh, his socks are itchy. He needs to get a compression shirt. I need to make sure I don't have tags on the shirts that he's wearing. And I went out and I bought all of these new sensory friendly clothes and thought, okay, I'm addressing this root cause of his avoidance. However, it didn't help, right? Like the compression shirts, the tagless shirts that I researched, the special socks with no inseams, the special underwear that I ordered from special stores, none of it actually fixed his avoidance of putting on clothes. And so I was left confused as a parent. When he really started avoiding eating to the extent like he was just dropping foods, I would put, collagen powder and vitamins and some of the last things he was eating, or drinking chocolate milk, he would drop the chocolate milk. Okay, so I was getting super anxious and went to see therapists, got great occupational therapists, and they were also working under the assumption that it was a sensory thing. The reason he wasn't eating was because he didn't like the smell, the texture, the taste of things, okay? And so what we did was, based on that logic of sensory, we did feeding therapy. And it was very gentle. It was very gentle exposure, the SOS feeding protocol, where there was 30 different steps to expose him to a new food, starting with just being in the room with it, okay? And it was very playful. It was a play-based sensory therapy. And what the therapist noticed, and this woman was actually the first person who introduced me to PDA over 5 years ago, she noticed that he would, get used to the food and be open to bridging a food between a Lay's potato chip that was not wavy to a wavy potato chip. And that would be a sensory bridge to expand what he was eating sensorially. But as soon as he would bridge to like the wavy potato chip, he would drop the regular Lay's potato chip, and he would always hover around 5 processed foods. And so even though he was moving through this sensory exposure and branching out, he was then dropping and not expanding his repertoire of food. So again, the therapist said, from a sensory-based perspective, he's making progress, but I don't understand why he keeps refusing and dropping food that we've just, he used to be comfortable with. Okay? And then finally, one of the things that we were experimenting with, because you just do the best you can as a parent with what you know at the time, again, was that root cause of sensory, of he's dysregulated because he needs more deep pressure, he needs more proprioceptive input, he needs to do an obstacle course to regulate himself. So this is when my husband was working out of the home full time and I was a full-time caregiver, and we would both go down into the basement and set up these obstacle courses and encourage him to run through them so that he would be more regulated for my day with him and my other son, who was 1 at the time. But what we observed was not only did it not make him more regulated, us encouraging him and putting pressure on and putting a lot of attention on this obstacle course actually was making him more dysregulated. Okay, so what was going on? Does this mean that my son doesn't have sensory issues? No, sensory is a big part of his profile. However, the defining feature of his avoidance was not the sensory. The defining feature was a unique aspect of his brain related to pathological demand avoidance or pervasive drive for autonomy. Okay, so you all see this brain that I like to have behind me, and that red part, the limbic system, or the part of our brain that perceives threat, is happening on a subconscious level, okay? And for a PDA child like my son, that perception of threat is directly tied to one root cause, or you could call it 2, but this is to simplify for you guys. And I'd love to hear if this is making sense as you follow along with me live, or, reflect on it if you're listening to it as a podcast. So the one root cause that was defining everything in his and our life was the perception of threat around, did he have autonomy? Did he get to decide if he did the obstacle course? Did he get to decide if he ate the wavy potato chips or the other potato chips? Autonomy and equality, meaning, was he equal to or above us, okay, to feel safe? Anytime he did not feel like he had the ability to decide, be the decider or the authority of what he was doing and be equal to or above us or the therapist, or he didn't have full autonomy, his limbic system and his amygdala, that part of the brain that subconsciously perceives threat, would activate his fight-flight response and cause avoidance, okay? And when his nervous system activated, it would exacerbate the sensory issues. But the first line of defense, logically, that I had to wrap my brain around was that singular root cause of what is causing the demand avoidance. Okay, so why does this matter? This isn't just parsing semantics, and this isn't an advocacy debate about diagnostic categories. What I really care about for all of you, who I think most of you are parents like me, is cutting through the confusion that's getting in the way of developing the skills and way of thinking that can truly transform your family with a PDA, okay? So let's take another example from an example that comes up a lot in our programs, which is a family who has an autism diagnosis, and they're operating under the assumption that their child's primary root cause of avoidance is the following things: social communication differences and sensory overwhelm and anxiety. Okay, and that can lead to school avoidance, right? So they're thinking like, oh my gosh, all these other kids, these social dynamics, these bright lights in the cafeteria, the sounds of the bells in the hallways, negative social feedback, anxieties coming up. Of course, rationally, this child avoids school. But then they bring the child home where there's not other kids, where they can address the anxiety, where the sensory input is much more controlled. And if it's a PDA child, not only autistic, then things continue to be avoidant and activated, and the child refuses to learn. And this is super confusing because we haven't considered that root cause of PDA, which is a survival drive for autonomy and equality that is so strong, it will consistently override other survival instincts like toileting, sleep, hygiene, safety, and or eating, okay? Either in the moment or in accumulation over time. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So when we put on the PDA lens and understand that, oh, it wasn't just sensory overwhelm in the cafeteria and the hallways, and it wasn't just these social dynamics or, quote, lack of social skills, or the cognitive worry about going to school, it was actually that the child did not have autonomy and perceived that all the teachers and other kids were above them, so the nervous system is going off constantly, right? And what's important to understand here is that just because your child is PDA doesn't mean they don't also have root causes like anxiety, social communication differences, or sensory issues. But if there's a PDA root cause, it's going to be driving the bus, okay? It's going to be the defining feature. And until we start addressing not the demands, which is like what we see on the surface, of course, lowering demands is helpful, but until we get to that really root cause and be rigorous about how we think about it and everything that flows from there, if we're not working on the autonomy and the equality piece, we can never make the amount of progress that I know that all of you want to see with your families, right? So the other reason this is important, and this is something that, I address with families that I work with, which is not all demand avoidance is PDA, right? So it's very important as a parent to determine, and you unfortunately may have to do this for yourself because there's not a good understanding of this root cause of a survival drive for autonomy and equality. Is my child anxious and needs more exposure and pushing through the sticky brain? Is this more like OCD? Or is this a panic response, and if I push them through it, it can lead to a loss of trust and trauma? Okay, so the way that we're understanding it here is like exposure or a little bit more behavioral approaches work for some kids, right? And if you have OCD type avoidance, you actually don't want to, quote, accommodate it, because then it leads to like a sticky loop in the brain where it gets bigger, right? So we have to be discerning as parents and really understand these mechanisms, or else we'll be ascribing one way of supporting a child to all children who are demand avoidant, right? So the second thing that I hope is helpful is the reflection for all of you to set down this idea of demand avoidance for a minute and just start to think about all the other things in your child's life that have nothing to do with avoiding, because there's so many things that have to do with basic needs, masking, cumulative nervous system activation, and equalizing behavior that aren't avoidant at all. So I want to just briefly mention these to you so that you can get a sense of how this plays out. Okay, so one of the things that I think that I know has been left out of the conversation about PDA with the focus on the behaviors and the demand avoidance is the way that this nervous system disability impacts or disables your child from accessing their basic needs, especially if they're in burnout. Okay, so I just want to go through the 5 types of basic needs that we see an impact on, and recognize that this is cumulative over time, not just a day, not just like restraint collapse after school, but like it could be building in the system for weeks, months, or even years. And that this disabling of accessing basic needs may only become clear as the child nears burnout or the teen nears burnout. And it can be fluctuating, right? So what do I mean by that? I just want to give you some examples. So I chatted with you a little bit about my son, right? Where he had very restricted eating, right? It was disabling him from eating food. For some families, this plays out with compulsive eating or constant eating, where control is coalescing around one or more basic needs. And there's usually one stickiest basic need where it's most pronounced, right? With toileting, one of the things we might see is withholding. We might see UTIs or constipation that can lead to encopresis, right? Where control is actually coalescing around voiding or defecating, okay? We might see a child who will only void in a diaper, in the backyard, in the bathtub, or only pee next to the toilet, okay? So physiologically, they're being impacted by their nervous system going off all the time, so it slows the metabolism, and it can cause accidents when we have that mobilization, right? But we actually also see that control coalescing around that basic need. So, this is something that doesn't get talked about that much because we're so focused on the behavior, but in my experience supporting so many hundreds of families, there's usually at least one basic need that's impacted to the point where you're concerned enough to seek medical support or therapeutic support. The next would be sleep. So moving into a non-24-hour sleep cycle, constant night waking, needing to co-sleep or be in the room with the parent, sometimes physically against them, regardless of age. This isn't a developmental thing. This is a lack of safety and trying to control around a basic need, okay? So then we also have hygiene. So your kid might be fine with sleeping, fine with eating, fine with toileting, but they will not brush their teeth or bathe or cut their hair or cut their nails, okay? So that would be hygiene. And then the 5th one is safety, right? So when we're impacted, when their nervous system is so impacted that it's disabling their ability to be safe with themselves, whether this is like hurting oneself or harming another, okay? So this is just to plant a seed with you all and get back to the core of what I believe PDA is, to support you in understanding how this is different than like demand avoidance you might see in ADHD because there's an executive functioning issue and we need to have executive functioning supports to address the avoidance, or quote rational demand avoidance in autism that might need to be supported in a different way than a child who's PDA autistic or PDA ADHD or just PDA. Okay, so the next thing that parents can look for is masking. Okay, so if we're looking through a non-PDA autism lens, what do we think about with masking? We think about children or teens or adults imitating neurotypical norms, like imitating other kids to stay safe with the way that people are talking, scripts, behaviors of other children. When I'm thinking about masking through the PDA lens, what I'm really thinking about is a nervous system pathway. Okay, so a lot of us, like my son was so different, like absolutely 2 different children before he hit burnout in school and with his grandparents versus at home. Like when I would pick him up from school, he was like Mr. Social, Mr. Fun, like everybody liked him, outgoing. No way on God's green earth someone would think that he was autistic, ever. Okay? He was like Mr. Social, Mr. Eye Contact, Mr. Talking. Okay? And he would, as soon as he turned away from the school, because I would walk to get him, I would see his face fall. He would start growling, and I would put his pacifiers in the pockets of his sweatshirt, and he would bike home as fast as he could, 3 blocks. And as soon as he walked in the door, it was like a different child. Screaming, meltdowns, focusing on attacking his brother or destroying his brother's things constantly. Like if I tried to talk to him, it'd be like, stop talking. Okay. So these 2 different versions, to me, what was happening is he was still perceiving that threat at school. He was constantly having those losses of autonomy and equality, but it was just going down the freeze and shut down or fawn pathway, right? So he was just not letting it out into the fight flight. And so I think that this is a subconscious perception of threat thing, of like, on a certain level, my amygdala knows that it's not actually safe for me to be in fight flight in a school environment. And I am going to go down this freeze pathway or this other pathway. And then the amygdala, as soon as they see me, the safest of the safe, it's like, okay, it all comes out, right? So this is a little bit of a different way of thinking about what this pattern is with PDA kids. It's not just imitating other kids. It's actually internalizing that nervous system response. Okay. The other thing that I think is different about a PDA child, and again, this isn't avoidant, right? What I'm about to say isn't avoidance at all. You tell them not to do something and they fixate on the thing. Like I remember long before I knew about PDA, I had just had my second son. This is when we were still living in Washington, D.C., and I remember I was trying to take the kids on a walk, and he didn't want to go on the walk, so there was avoidance there. But then I was like, no, you have to go on this double stroller. You can stand here, and we're gonna like just walk around the block to get the baby some fresh air. And he would put his feet on the ground and drag them to make it hard for me to push. Okay. And the more I was correcting that behavior, the more intensely he would shove his feet down or do things like grab a stick and put it between the wheels to try and make it hard for me to push. Okay. So that's not avoidant at all. In some ways, that's equalizing behavior of like, mom did something that gave me a loss of autonomy and equality. This is the amygdala speaking, not the conscious brain. Just like nervous system activation. Okay, my nervous system is going to behave in a way to get me back to safety, but I need to be above my mom. Okay? And so it's very difficult behavior where it can be controlling, criticizing, sometimes lying or manipulating to get to a place of being above the person who put down the boundary or said the thing that they have to do, or it can be stifled all day at school, and then you're the loving parent at home and they come out and all the equalizing behavior comes out at you, even if you are not setting boundaries, even if you are not taking away their autonomy in that moment. Okay, so this is a pattern that I believe is very unique to PDA and not necessarily a part of ADHD or autism, which of course has nervous system activation, dysregulation, and challenges. But PDA autism or PDA and ADHD, you see this equalizing behavior very uniquely. Okay, so again, I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's just something to look for your own clarity and understanding the root cause, and that this is a nervous system driven behavior. Okay, finally, the thing that I think can be so confusing for parents is the cumulative nature of PDA. Okay, so all of the teachers, all of the therapists, all of the medical professionals who work with behavior. This includes neurodiversity affirming practitioners. Unfortunately, a lot of them have not made the true paradigm shift. They're going to be operating under this assumption that there's an antecedent to the behavior, there's a behavior, and there's a consequence. Okay, so they're always going to be trying to help you look for what happened right before the behavior. And I did this too. When I was trying to figure out my son's behavior, I took the prowess of my social science training from a doctorate degree and created spreadsheets and was I was going to do statistical regressions on my child's behavior. And I was like, okay, what happened today? What happened at this moment? And just trying to organize this. So I'm sure many of you have busted out those Excel spreadsheets and tried to track everything that happens before there's this big explosion, or before the avoidance, or before the equalizing. And what is really was helpful to me, that it took me a long time to understand, and what has been helpful for the parents I work with, is understanding that it's not an antecedent in the traditional sense, what sets off your child. It's a tipping point, because what happened last week at school may not play out for another week. And then you're with them, accommodating and being chill and lowering demands and providing nervous system safety. And all of a sudden they're going to have a big explosion where you're like, wait, I did the exact same thing yesterday and nothing happened. What's going on? And this is why some parents, especially when their externalized child is in burnout and it's very extreme, they think they're schizophrenic, or they have a mood disorder, or they're bipolar, right? Because they can't find the antecedent. But with PDA, it's cumulative. So what that means is especially for our kids who suddenly go into burnout and it looks like an autistic regression, what's happening is it didn't just happen. They're having all these activations in their survival brain and they're keeping it internalized. And then they reach a point where they can't do that anymore. And so all of it comes out. Okay. And so it's fluctuating. And this is what makes it very difficult of my younger son, I'm using the PDA lens with him currently because he started to have basic needs struggles. But before that, I was looking much more through a sensory anxiety and autism lens. So, for him, it's anytime there's a loud sound, he's going to go like this. It's just always the same, and I can see it. Or every time I do the blender, he's going to put his hands over his ears. But for my pure PDA son, who it's that's what's driving the bus, sometimes he doesn't care about the sensory stuff at all, right? And other times, if he's had that accumulation, he's going to be if I turn on the blender, right? So this fluctuating nature that's really defined by the nervous system over time is so important to understand, because the goal then becomes, how do we get that down over time so that they can have a window? So even if they get activated because of how their brain works, they're not going to be in this burnout state constantly activated. Okay, so the two things I wanted to do for you today for clarity, sort of a back to basics, is how not all demand avoidance is PDA, and what can be helpful is looking beneath the demand avoidance to decide what's the root cause. The root cause of PDA demand avoidance being the perception subconsciously that there's not autonomy and equality. And then the importance of looking at basic needs, impact, and other things like masking, equalizing behavior, and understanding that cumulative nature. So because I have noticed so much confusion among parents and some professionals, I am planning to, with your help, offer a live masterclass, which I have not done in about 2 years, about understanding PDA, understanding how to use the PDA lens and bringing to bear the results from our survey that we did with the University of Michigan Medical School, which we actually did the survey 2 years ago, but we've been developing a measure for PDA that includes not just some of these behaviors that can be paradoxical, but also basic needs. Okay, so I'm really excited to share that with you. I am currently doing a survey so you can help me understand where you're getting stuck around the logic. And it may feel like, oh, I know what PDA is, I don't need to do this, which of course, like, no pressure, but everything that I teach is flowing from this particular logic. Okay, so the decisions that we make as parents, the decision-making framework, how we advocate, how we help them develop a healthy self-concept, how we help them with identity, all the accommodations, like, they're free for the taking for anyone who wants them with a neurodivergent kid or whoever it's helpful to. But everything that I teach is flowing from this logic, okay? So I am just going to look in here. What about my son doesn't get the rating on the PDA test you have on your website, but this lens still makes sense? Okay, so the rating, the EDAQ, the Extreme Demand Avoidance Questionnaire, is not something that I developed. It was done in 2014. And it's the best current measure we have, right? But because it's really measuring mostly externalized behaviors, it doesn't include internalization. It also doesn't take into account masking, and it doesn't take into account the impact on basic needs. We see the best available thing that we have now, right? Which is awesome. They did this great research and they put this out there, and it's been helpful for so many of us. And now, as a researcher and academic, my next step is taking that and improving upon it so we can build our body of knowledge, which is how research works, right? And then someone's going to come and be like, Casey, your measure isn't great. Like, you forgot about this and I can do it better. And then they're going to create a better measure, right? But this is what it is. This is how we build knowledge in a space, by doing the research and having people pick it apart and be like, I would have done this differently, or you forgot about this, or what about this, or, you know, and then they're going to do a better job, right? And we're going to move towards a body of literature, I hope, that will support families and professionals to better identify these children and teens and develop supports that aren't just sort of, you know, this works for ADHD kids, so we're just going to like flop it over here for the PDAers, and then we see things get worse with them because they're operating from the wrong logic. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. It was so nice to be here with all of you, and I will see you again soon.